Imagine being a judge, someone who upholds the law, protects people's rights, and ensures justice is served. Now, imagine that same judge being thrown into handcuffs, humiliated, and treated like a common criminal. Not because she committed a crime, but because of the color of her skin. This is the shocking true story of a black female judge who found herself on the wrong side of the law, not for breaking it, but because a racist cop saw an opportunity to abuse his power. It started as a regular day. She was on her way home, dressed professionally, carrying herself with the same dignity and authority she always did. But that didn't matter to one officer who had already decided she fit the description of a robbery suspect. No investigation, no questions, just immediate judgment. And before she could even process what was happening, she was being forced against a police car, hands yanked behind her back. She told him who she was. She even offered to show her identification. But the cop wasn't interested in the truth, only in proving his control. Witnesses stood in shock, some recording, others frozen in disbelief. How could something like this happen to someone who literally represents the law? But here's where it gets even worse. When the real truth about the so-called robbery comes out, it exposes something far bigger than just one bad cop. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. As she stood there, wrists locked in cold steel, the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an insult, an abuse of power, a violation of everything she stood for. She had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, ensuring that people were treated fairly, regardless of their background. And now, in an instant, she was being denied that same justice. The officer didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. It was as if he had already made up his mind, and nothing she said could change it. Around them, a small crowd gathered, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. A woman in the crowd finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "She's a judge. You're making a mistake." But the officer barely glanced her way. Instead, he tightened the cuffs, forcing the judge toward his squad car. Her heart pounded, but she stayed calm. She had seen this happen to others before, innocent people accused, their voices ignored. But now it was happening to her. And then, just as she was being shoved into the back seat, another officer approached, looking confused. He held a radio in one hand, listening intently before turning to the arresting officer. "Wait, are you sure about this?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the officer's face, but it was gone in an instant. "She matches the description," he muttered. But what description? And who exactly was behind this so-called robbery? The truth was about to unravel, and it wasn't what anyone expected. Inside the squad car, the judge sat still, her mind racing. She had spent years upholding the law, yet here she was, treated like a criminal with no voice, no presumption of innocence. The officer in the driver's seat avoided her eyes, gripping the wheel as if his decision to arrest her couldn't be questioned. Outside, the small crowd continued to grow, their voices rising, demanding answers. Meanwhile, the officer who had hesitated earlier was still talking into his radio, his expression shifting from doubt to concern. "She doesn't fit the full description," he finally said. But the arresting officer scoffed, tightening his grip on the door. She was near the location. Dark clothing. Right height. It's her. His voice was firm, but there was something uneasy about the way he said it. Then a new voice entered the mix, a detective arriving at the scene. He had been working the robbery case and had actual details, not just vague assumptions. His eyes moved from the officer to the judge, then to the squad car. "What's her name?" he asked. The officer hesitated. He hadn't even checked her ID. The detective's face hardened as he recognized her. "You just arrested a sitting judge." The crowd gasped as murmurs spread. The officer's grip on the car door tightened, but he didn't move to release her. If he let her go now, it would be an admission of a mistake. And some mistakes could cost a career. But if he didn't, the situation could spiral even further out of control. The tension in the air was suffocating. The detective's words had landed like a hammer, but the officer still didn't move. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Letting her go now meant admitting fault, and something about that seemed harder for him to accept than the truth itself. Inside the squad car, the judge's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had seen men like him before, officers who refused to back down. She knew this wasn't just about a robbery. It was about power, about control, and about the kind of assumptions that had led to countless innocent people being mistreated, arrested, or worse. The crowd was no longer just whispering. People were demanding answers, their voices rising. "Let her go," someone shouted. A man pulled out his phone, speaking directly into the camera. "They just arrested a judge without proof. Y'all seeing this?" The officer's radio crackled again. More details were coming in. The real suspect, already identified, was someone entirely different. Different hairstyle, different build. The only similarity, skin color. The detective's face darkened. "You messed up," he said, low and firm. "Open that door. Now." But the officer didn't move. His grip only tightened on the door handle. His face was unreadable, but there was something flickering behind his eyes, something that made the judge uneasy. He wasn't just hesitating. He was deciding. And that's when everything took an even darker turn. The silence stretched thick and heavy as the officer stood frozen. The detective's command hung in the air, but something in the officer's stance sent a chill through the judge. He wasn't just reluctant, he was resisting. Then, just as the detective reached for the door handle himself, the officer stepped back, hand hovering over his holster. The message was clear. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about control, and he wasn't ready to let it slip away. The judge's breath caught. She had seen tense moments like this in court, when emotions ran high and logic fought against impulse. But this wasn't a courtroom. Here, she had no gavel, no authority, just the growing realization that she was at the mercy of a man who refused to admit he was wrong. Then the radio crackled again, louder this time. Another officer's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "Suspect apprehended. Repeat, we have the robbery suspect in custody." Different location, no connection to the woman in custody. The detective's eyes locked onto the arresting officer. "That's it. Open the door." But before he could, a new set of flashing lights appeared. An unmarked car pulled up fast, stopping inches from the scene. Two men in suits stepped out, internal affairs. Someone had already reported the incident, and now the officer wasn't just facing a bad call. He was facing an investigation. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the judge realized something. The officer wasn't surprised to see them. He was afraid. The tension in the air shifted. The officer's posture stiffened, his eyes darting between the detective, the judge, and the two men approaching. His hand, still hovering near his holster, twitched. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. This was bigger. The man from Internal Affairs stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Officer, release her. Now." For a long second, no one moved. Then with slow, reluctant hands, the officer reached for the door and yanked it open. The judge stepped out, her wrists aching as he unlocked the cuffs. The moment the metal clicked free, the crowd erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. But the judge didn't speak. She just turned to the officer, her steady gaze locking onto his. She wanted to ask him why. why he had ignored her credentials, why he had clung so tightly to his false assumptions. But she already knew the answer. Then the final twist came. One of the men in suits pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages before landing on something specific. "This isn't your first incident," he said, his voice sharp. "You've had multiple complaints, racial profiling, excessive force, and now an illegal arrest of a sitting judge." The officer's face drained of color. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was a pattern. And now it was all catching up to him. The judge exhaled slowly. Justice was finally turning in the right direction. But deep down, she knew the real fight wasn't just about one cop. It was about a system that let it happen in the first place. The officer stood frozen, his face unreadable, but the weight of what was happening was clear. There was no way out of this. The detective stepped forward, nodding toward internal affairs. "You'll be answering for this," he said firmly. It was no longer just about what had happened today. It was about everything that had come before it. The judge rubbed her wrists, feeling the sting where the cuffs had been. She had spent years believing in the justice system, working to make it fair for everyone. But today was proof that even those who dedicated their lives to the law weren't immune to its failures. As the officer was pulled aside for questioning, the judge turned to the detective. "What happens now?" she asked. He sighed, glancing at the growing crowd, the flashing lights, the cameras still rolling. "He's done," he said simply. "But this won't fix everything." She nodded, already knowing that was true. One officer facing consequences wouldn't erase the deeper issues. But maybe, just maybe, it would start a conversation. Maybe the people watching would realize how easily this could happen to anyone, no matter their title, no matter their accomplishments. As she walked away, the crowd parted for her, murmurs following in her wake. She wasn't just another victim of injustice. She was a reminder, a warning. And for those who thought power gave them the right to judge without reason, she was proof that the truth always has a way of coming out.